example, a little story. We have a home, a very nice vacation home in Bethany Beach, Delaware. I'm not sure. Anybody been to Delaware Shore? You know, a few people. It's actually it's a place that's within Fenwick Island State Park, and it's a little tiny community called Bayview Park, and it's really nice because it's surrounded by some marshland on one side. And you cross the highway, there's the ocean on the other. And even though most of the time it's basically populated by during the summer by people who come down there for the summer, there are a few people who live there all year round. And in particular, there's one person, an old retiree, and her husband. Her name is Fifi. And Fifi's a great person to have around because she's a consummate emailer. And what she does is she loves emailing everybody who's not there what's going on with the weather in Bethany Beach, and in particular Bayview Park. So in particular, she likes it when there's like a particularly severe thunderstorm, and she'll say, well, there was a thunderstorm last night. You all missed it, but no worries. Everything's fine. The so-and-so's garbage can blew away, but I was out there and I retrieved it and I put it back and so forth. Well, anyway, with that, last October, there was kind of an interesting thing happened. There was one weather event, which you probably are familiar with, that was coming up and approaching the Delaware coast, which I was thinking basically is probably going to be one that Fifi is not going to be riding out and probably will not be telling us about. And my undergrad was in meteorology, and I grew up actually wanting to be a hurricane forecaster. So even though I've kind of moved on to different things, I've never lost my love for weather and hurricanes. And so, in fact, I'm kind of really kind of nerdy about it, and I always subscribe to all these different high-end weather sites and so forth. So anyway, towards the end of October, when I was following Sandy as it was coming out of the Caribbean, I looked at kind of the latest, one of the latest forecasting models, and it had an image which just totally blew my mind, okay? And this was the image. And this was a picture of a forecast of in 3 days, there would be basically a tropical hurricane or superstorm of really absolutely unprecedented proportions that would be making landfall on the Jersey Shore just south of Atlantic City. And I looked at this, and I just really couldn't believe my eyes that this sort of a thing would actually be happening. It would be sort of the equivalent of, like this Sunday, turning on the TV to watch the Super Bowl and finding out that the Ravens are actually playing the Penn Quakers, okay? That it would be that kind of an extreme, this can't possibly be happening in an event. So anyway, so we went down to, I talked to my wife, and we said, you know, we got to get down to the shore house, we got to tidy things up. And, you know, we did what we could, and we put things away and everything. And so then I was just sort of curious as to, you know, what would happen, what other people were doing. And I noticed that people in Bethany Beach in particular didn't seem like going crazy about this particular storm. That in particular, you know, I rushed to, I was really worried that back in Philadelphia we wouldn't have enough batteries and things on hand, so I went to the local store there. There was no problem getting tons of battery supplies. And then the next day I came back, and it turns out we get an email from Fifi. Okay? And what the email says basically is we just heard that an evacuation order is mandatory for where we live starting at 8 p.m. tonight. Again, even though we have friends inland that have kind of told us to come on in and stay with them, we've decided to ride it out. Then in particular, you know, we have seawater. We might get seawater in our ground level, but we'll deal with that. Our house is 50 years old, and we've never had anything wrong, so we're going to try to ride the storm out. But what was really interesting was not so much this introduction, but the analysis that she gave, which is very, very precise for why it was that she felt that it was safe to stay in her house. And this is what it was. We built here right after the '62 nor'easter. Now, for those of you who are weather fans or kind of are particularly old, you might know that the '62 Ash Wednesday storm was a major catastrophe that basically destroyed the Delaware and Jersey shores. And so this is sort of the landmark historical event for bad weather. So anyway, so afterwards, when they built their house, we went around and we asked people, how high does a house have to be? And we were told that any house in this area that was 2 cinder blocks up had problems. 3 cinder blocks were okay, but so we decided to do it one better. We were going 4 cinder blocks up. So anyway, so in all these years, we've never had any water in the house, not even in the studio. We're going to stay here, and I'll report in to give you updates. So I looked at that, and that was incredibly reassuring because it meant that I know our house is on stilts, so we know we're way more than 4 cinder blocks up. And so we figured, well, this is going to be nice. You know, it's nice that she's going to be riding us out and give us frequent updates. Well, anyway, the next morning, and this is the following night is when Sandy was supposed to make landfall, we get the first email from Fifi. And what it shows is it says, "Good morning from the beach. Yes, we have water, lots of it." Attaches a picture I just looking out over our backyard. And clearly, Fifi was just delighted that she was there riding it out while everybody else were cowards and went home. And as you see, the water is starting to get pretty high. It's actually come up over the docks and so forth. So anyway, so I was waiting during the course of the day because I knew the storm was moving inland and through that night and so forth. Problem was then radio silence. No further word from Fifi through the 29th or all day the 30th. And at this point, I'm starting to get a little bit nervous. What's happened to Fifi? What happened to that place down there? And it was really hard to figure out because all the news coverage was focusing on, obviously, New York and upper New Jersey, and nobody was saying anything what happened to Delaware, and I just couldn't find out anything. Well, anyway, so later on the 30th, I happened to be on looking at the CNN site, and they had a link to a video from the Wall Street Journal online that had a video of a helicopter going over what turned out to be our community in Delaware. And this is at the end of the day on the 30th when waters were beginning to recede, and this is what the picture showed. And that circle is sort of what our house was, and this is actually after the water had started to go down, and I realized, okay, that things are not necessarily so happy there. Well, it turned out that what actually happened was the water came up the equivalent of 5 to 6 cinder blocks in that particular community. And Fifi was all right. She had kind of like a bad night, obviously, and trying to deal with the water. And there was carpets and fabric and so forth, and couches that got ruined. And the sad part, of course, she lost her car because she had a car there, and that was no way that was going to be salvageable. And as for us, I mean, this is kind of like what happened to our boat, which got lifted up off a lift and pitched and so forth. And in many respects, as bad as sort of this was, it of course was just a very, very small survivable event relative to what many other people experienced in the course of Sandy and lots of other disasters. But basically, it underscored something that for me, it was the first time I'd personally experienced, even though I'd been doing research on this for so long, how really hard it is to kind of imagine extreme events and how hard it is to fully prepare for these sorts of things. So what I'm going to be doing tonight is talking a little bit about two topics. One of which is the general question of why we tend to underprepare for hazards, and secondly, what we can do about it. What is it that we can make ourselves sort of more resilient to basically making sure that if these things are going to happen, we're at least going to be able to ride it out with as minimal pain as possible. Okay, where I'd like to start off is talking a little bit about the topic which I like to call the psychology of misfortune, or how it is that we tend to get ourselves in these situations. Now, the one thing I want to stress is that even though a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is mistakes in preparation, why is it that we don't fully prepare, why it is as societies and individuals we don't often invest enough in protection, I really want to emphasize that in many cases people do adequately prepare, and in some cases go the opposite, prepare well beyond. Like, for example, if you know anyone that's ever actually personally experienced truly traumatic outcomes, you knew someone that was closely involved in the 9/11 terrorist attacks, or alternatively, if you survived a tornado with the house blowing out around you, these are people who actually don't have a problem in preparation. In fact, they're extremely vigilant. Unfortunately, that's sort of very, very rare in the population. It's also the case that you have kind of extreme outliers of people who prepare for things that are threats that don't exist at all. Like, for example, does anyone want to guess what this is? Anyone? These were, I'll let you give you a hint, these are items which were very popular. It was a big market for these in the late 19th century, and to protect against some truly awful thing. Yes? Vampire box? Vampire protection kit, yes, sir. And you can actually get some of these things on eBay, and I can assure you they're 100% effective. No one has ever suffered a vampire bite from one of these vampire protection kits. There's also, if you were looking at the Sunday New York Times this week, there's the preppers movement in New York. Which is, what is it that you need to have if all hell breaks loose and you have to be on your own in the city? So therefore, you refer to the Sunday Times for what that package should look like. But I really want to emphasize that these are kind of extreme examples, that most of the time the real problems that we deal with are or the fact that we tend to underprepare for events. And a lot of my career has been spent trying to understand the different biases that go in when people make decisions to invest in protection, and why it is that often we find ourselves suffering losses that in hindsight we'd say if we had only done this, we'd only done that, we would have been spared from that. And I'm able to kind of break that down into kind of a simple sort of acronym, and that's OUCH. Okay, and what this tends to stand for is sort of the four, in my mind, major mechanisms or major drivers that cause people to underprepare. Okay, what are they? Well, the first one is that for the first part, is that we tend to actually overestimate the incidence of bad events. Often you hear people say, well, people have a tendency to think that it's not going to happen to me. Actually, most of the research shows that people tend to think that events themselves actually are going to happen to them. If you go ahead and ask people, what's the likelihood that you're going to be you're going to be mugged in a city? Okay, actually, the numeric estimate that people give is way higher than what that actual likelihood is, or suffer a plane crash, or as I'll show you later, the likelihood of experiencing hurricane winds of a certain velocity. Where the mistakes tend to happen, or where kind of the errors tend to take place, is not in people's beliefs about whether or not it will happen, but rather how bad it's going to be. That in particular, the more critical bias is that we tend to underestimate tail impact and duration. We tend to think things that when we think about how bad it could be are not going to be quite as bad as the reality extreme could be, and also we tend not to think that they're going to last as long. Like in particular in hurricanes, one thing that people really get wrong is they often think that what they need to prepare for is the hurricane event itself. Actually, the hurricane event itself is not really the big deal. It's what happens after the hurricane that you have to worry about. So what often people think about when getting batteries. How many batteries do I need? Well, how long is the hurricane going to last? Well, no, that's not quite right, okay? You're really not going to need batteries during the hurricane. It's actually the 2 weeks after the hurricane when you don't have power is when you tend to have problems. It's very difficult for people to appreciate that. Another one is the C part of it is we tend to be overly myopic in terms of we tend to concentrate our attention on a small set of information channels and preparation actions. In particular, where this really comes home to become important is often it becomes very, very difficult for us to go ahead and broadly seek the kind of knowledge that we would need to get to anticipate what the risks are and to think about what appropriate actions tend to be. That, for example, what tends to happen in hurricanes is that people who study media consumption over time, and I'll show you some evidence on this, is what was happening in Sandy, for example, is what do people do, where do they get their information from as the storm approaches? Where do you get your information from? TV, okay? And it's a curious thing what happens is that normally people who are kind of active internet users, who actually talk to people and are on Facebook and Twitter and so forth, actually what happens is storms get closer and closer and closer, they actually shut off usage of all those things, and they tend to sit in front of the TV and they watch what's going on the Weather Channel and CNN. And all of a sudden, to the degree to which people are sharing information, is they're all kind of communally watching this one particular source. And that actually turns out to be sort of problematic, because often what it does is it prohibits them from getting a lot of the personal impact information that they need. The Weather Channel and Jim Cantore sitting on the beach in New York is not going to be telling you about whether or not Bethany Beach has under a mandatory evacuation order, and that ends up being a bit of an issue. So in some sense, you can kind of think of this as the fact that we don't really have much of a problem in deciding whether to prepare. The problem that we have is deciding how much to prepare. And then finally, the last one, and this is when I'll give you a lot of examples of this, we're just absolutely terrible learners from experience. History just repeats itself over and over and over again. And as much as I'm just sitting here and I know this is going to happen, as much as you who might have sort of been without power for a long time with Sandy and so forth, the reality is my guess is it's going to be a long time before another one happens. And when it does, the same thing's going to happen to you all over again. And so one of the big challenges that we have in the research that we're doing is try to figure out how to get people to be better learners from disastrous events. Okay, so what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time giving you examples of each of these sorts of biases, and then kind of towards the end, kind of talk about, okay, now what do we do to fix all this? Given that these biases exist, what are remedies for it? One of my favorite and maybe most extreme examples of people having a difficult time, well, not only learning, but more critically, underestimating what tail events are like, is the Galveston and the seawall. Has anybody been to Galveston, Texas? Galveston? Okay. The main thing if you're like a disaster maven, Galveston is known for one thing, okay, and that is the Great 1900 Hurricane. This is the greatest loss of life that's ever happened from a natural disaster in U.S. history. Category 4 hurricane came in. At that time, there were no warnings. There was no National Weather Service. There was no Weather Channel, obviously. And effectively, there's a whole bunch of people were sitting in Galveston, and the storm came in, wiped out the city, and 8,000 people died. And as a consequence, after that, I guess the temptation might have been to say, well, let's not ever rebuild along this barrier island out here. Let's not rebuild the city. But their decision was to say, well, we need to build a more resilient city. So what they did was that they elevated the city and built a great seawall. And in fact, the seawall ended up being an incredibly positive thing in the sense that after that, Galveston never had hurricane problems before. Even though hurricanes did come and go, there was another big one that hit like in 1915, and no problem. Okay, basically, it's very, very difficult to get storm surges that are going to be above that particular level. The problem is that over time, Galveston used to be kind of a seaport, but then over time, its main value is one of more of a tourist destination. And so if you live in Houston, what do you like to do? Well, maybe go to the beach. And so would you consider going to the beach at Galveston? Okay, look at the picture. No, there's one thing Galveston doesn't have, and this is unfortunate downside of the seawall. As great of a protective device it makes for lousy beaches. And so one of the problems that happens is that that if you're in Houston and you want to get that nice summer home, where do you want to build it? Do you want to build it behind the seawall, the nice resilient seawall in Galveston, or do you want to build it away from the seawall? Well, it turns out that most of the newer development within Galveston was not in Galveston town itself, but rather in the barrier islands just to the north and just to the south of Galveston. For example, the Boulevard Peninsula. And this is taken on September 9th, 2008. And as you see, this is just a really nice place to have a beach house because you don't have that ugly seawall in front of you, and you can just walk down to the beach and so on. Well, anyway, a few days later, Hurricane Ike came along, and this was that same spot after Hurricane Ike. And so you might look at this and say, well, okay, well, maybe the people went down there and knew the risks that they were facing. They were probably all wealthy, and they just figured, well, we'll just go ahead and rebuild it because we got insurance and so forth. But here's kind of the really weird part about this. It turns out that only 40% of the people who lived there had flood insurance. So you might imagine, how could you do that? Okay, and this is a case where it's not like people in Texas didn't know there were hurricanes. It was not like, because in fact, on top of the seawall in Galveston is a monument to the great loss of life from the 1900 storm, and so on and so on and so on. But yet somehow or another, when people were, there's a big gap between thinking vicariously about this historical event and high water and storms, and then making that connection to really how bad it can be, and what could potentially happen to your home. And particularly in this case, it's hopefully less this case way going forward, but in this case, flood insurance was incredibly cheap. In fact, it was government subsidized, and nevertheless, a significant portion of people didn't bother to go ahead and get it. Okay, we also did some data on Hurricane Sandy. One of the things our risk center does is we like to gather information about how people are making decisions about disastrous events. And in particular, in the case of hurricanes, it represents a great opportunity to see how people are thinking about hazards and are preparing for them in real time as the hazards are approaching. So in particular, in advance of Hurricane Sandy, we knew that obviously that this big storm was coming. So we started doing surveys of people all along the East Coast, from New York down to Maryland. And we were asking asking them a whole bunch of questions like things like, well, how likely do you think your home is to experience hurricane force winds, and what are you doing about it, and so forth. So what this graph is right here is, this is a timeline that shows starting about 2 or 3 days before the storm, we asked people, what do you think the probability is that your home will experience sustained hurricane force winds? Now, that's not like, a peak gust for a second of the hurricane force. That's a sustained hurricane force wind of 75 miles an hour, where typically the gusts, if that's your sustained, will be like approaching 100 miles an hour. And then this is the time course over time, and the last period right here is the survey during the afternoon, a few hours before Sandy made landfall. And as what you see, people were actually pretty pessimistic. This is actually the average of all people surveyed from New York all the way down to Maryland. Turns out in New York, the estimates were close to 80%. That is, they thought there was a pretty good chance that they were going to suffer hurricane force winds. But for most people, it tends to be like 50 to 60%, getting higher as the storm approaches. How accurate were those? Well, it turns out that the National Hurricane Center actually computes objective probabilities for the likelihood that your home will experience hurricane force winds. And it turns out this bottom line here is what the objective odds were. And basically, Sandy, as you might remember, was a really big storm and kicked up a lot of water, but in terms of sustained maximum winds, it was actually a Category 1 hurricane, kind of a low-end hurricane for most of it. And for most of these areas, the feeling was that the odds that you're going to get actually winds that high are actually pretty low. So people tended to be way overly pessimistic about that. So why would it be the case? Why would people be so pessimistic about the odds of getting hurricane winds? Media, right, okay, so in particular, it was all over the place. Basically, if you turn on the TV, they said, you're going to have one hell of a storm. You're going to get a hurricane. You're under a hurricane warning. So what would a hurricane warning mean if it's not going to mean that you're going to get hurricane winds, right? And so with that, you would kind of figure, well, if people are thinking they're going to get hurricane winds, and absolutely everybody knew about it, people ought to be pretty worried. Okay, how really worried were people? Well, it turns out not very. Then in particular, we also asked people, how safe do you think you'll be through this storm? And basically now, all of a sudden, people are saying, like on this 0 to 100 scale, 90, okay? Basically no worries at all. So we got this disconnect. On the one hand, they think this big storm's coming in. They're way more worried than the actual odds, yet they're not particularly worried about it. So why is that the case? Well, if you kind of remember what was going on, the media coverage was really mixed in the sense that you had the Weather Channel saying, your life is going to be over in a couple of hours, and Jim Cantore just telling everybody, standing there in Battery Park and saying, look, the water's coming up and so forth. Then on the other hand, you got a lot of part of media basically making fun of the thing. Okay, now if you remember this, the graph showing the different kinds of Sandys that are coming up, and then likewise, you also had things like, this is, preparation, okay? For Sandy, it's a party time, okay? That, what was preparation? Well, make sure you get extra beer, okay, and chips and so forth, and it's fun, but we're going to go to a hurricane. This is going to be cool, and so forth. Unfortunately, you kind of know what the consequences of all this was. What was the level of preparation that people were actually undertaking? And this is sort of what we found out in the survey. It was actually pretty shocking. First of all, like only 25% of people in New Jersey thought they might be without power for more than 2 days. So people knew this thing was coming in, but they didn't think it was going to last for very long. Another one, and this one's even more disturbing, only 16% of people that were in mandatory evacuation areas left. And also, while 95% of people took some preparation, most was of the low effort type. Basically, everybody said, well, you got to do something because they said you got to do something. So, what was it that they tended to do? Well, for example, only 37% of people who had shutters put them up. Now, by the way, the survey here was done of all people living right along the coast. This is particularly noteworthy because unlike in Florida, where basically everybody has storm shutters, it's actually kind of uncommon to find people in the coastal Northeast to have storm shutters. And typically, you have them there because so you're talking about people who are ordinarily kind of wary of storm events. But these are people, even though they had them, and this is like their one big chance to use them, even here, it's just figured, well, you know, it's a real hassle to put those things up and so forth. And another one, only 21% made the plans of where to go if they had to leave. And then it kind of gets worse. Of those people who are living with one block of the ocean or bay, only 38% thought that the main threat posed by Sandy was water. Okay, and so you kind of figure, well, you know, something's wrong there. If you see the water and you don't think that's a threat, there's some issue. And then also, among those same people, only 54% had flood insurance. So kind of the scale and the magnitude of this lack of aggregate preparation, in both in terms of long-term and short-term, was pretty staggering. And, you know, and we've seen kind of, you know, tons of consequences of all of this in terms of the post-Sandy events and news coverage. But for me, in many respects, probably the image that kind of tells it all is, this is a fairly recent one, is this one. I don't know if you've seen this. This is the Calverton Airport on Long Island. Does everybody know what these things are? Cars. Okay, 15,000 cars that were ruined by Hurricane Sandy. And what do you do with all those cars? Well, you can't sell them, okay, and at least you know, not legally, you can't sell them, and so forth. And it was the case that I was talking to an individual who was doing an indie film on Hurricane Sandy recovery, and he was talking to people who were who lived in Staten Island, and they had lost their car. And so what was weird about that was, this is a person, they were down at the bottom of a hill in Staten Island, and the water came up and went over their car, and they lost it. And the sad thing about it was that in preparing for it, it never occurred to the person to take the car and just move it up to the top of the hill. Okay, and mainly because why that happened, it's just so difficult to conceive something that's never happened before. Even though someone's telling you it's going to occur, just to imagine that extreme event is often really difficult. Okay, kind of the next sort of topic, or the next sort of bias I'd like to talk a little bit about, is this idea of kind of myopic focus. The idea that often we attend to very limited sources of information. And also it's the case that you know, when information is out there that potentially can inform us of a risk for certain types, we tend not to want to look at it, which also gets us into trouble. Like, for example, this is what I was mentioning earlier. One of the things we did in our surveys is we asked people as Hurricane Sandy was approaching, where did you get the most recent information about the storm? And these are all these different sources, and the big blue line is TV, which basically says it was one particular source. Internet is surprisingly limited, and things like social media. Basically, people weren't, you know, using their social media account as a source. Another one, though, and I think this is maybe more disconcerting, is the idea of what happens when people deliberately want to look away from information that otherwise can inform them of catastrophic events. For this one, there's another story. It involves a guy named Norman Braman. Does anybody know who Norman Braman is? Was it? Who said the Eagles? Yeah, he used to be the owner of the Eagles. Okay, he's actually very well known in Miami-Dade County. He's a philanthropist. He owns a large number of car dealerships and so forth. And he used to be the owner of the Eagles. The people in Philadelphia hated him as an owner, but then they hate all their owners, so that doesn't really mean a whole lot. So he lives down in there, and he's also kind of a philanthropist in the community, but he's also known as somebody who has very, very strong opinions about how his money should be spent and how the city should be spending its money and so on. A few years ago, he had a close relationship with the University of Miami, and he was prepared to make a $30 million gift to their medical school with the idea to help them build a new medical facility. But anyway, he got into big arguments with them because they wanted to buy an existing facility. They didn't think that was run by the county. He didn't think that was a good idea. And he basically said, look, I have a specific wish for my money, and if you're not going to honor it, I'm not going to give it to you, so I'm taking back my $30 million. Well, meanwhile, just as that was happening, my wife is also she's on the faculty at Wharton. For a while, she took a stint as the dean at the business school at the University of Miami. And this is who she is, Barbara Kahn. And what was interesting is right after that happened, she became the dean there, and she was looking for a naming gift for the school. And the president of the university, Donna Shalala, pulled her aside and said, I'll tell you what, I got this guy, his name is Norman Braman, and he's got $30 million to give. And so all you got to do is sort of get to know him, go out to lunch with him, make friends with him, and so forth. And he didn't want to give it to the medical school, but I'm sure you can get him to give it to the business school, and maybe you can make it even $50 million instead of going on top of that. So anyway, so she went out for a bunch of lunches with him, and in fact, she actually did interact with him really well. He seemed to like her, she seemed to like him, and so forth. And she definitely seen that this was something that was going to be coming. Well, basically, all of that changed in December of 2008. I'll always remember I was down there, and Barbara was looking at CNN, and there was this image, and it occurred at 9 a.m. on December 11th, and it was this picture, Bernard Madoff, being hauled away to prison. And you can kind of imagine the rest of the story. Turns out that Norman Braman had invested a large amount of his foundation money with Bernard Madoff, and there went the $30 million gift potentially to the business school. So with this, it's one of these things that people just kind of kept asking the question, how could that happen? That this is not like somebody who was a fly-by-night investor who got pulled in by an internet scam. This is Norman Braman, who was really prided himself on conservative investment, really controlling where his money went to and so forth. And because of that, and in fact, so in addition to that, what was also more sort of mind-boggling is there was a widespread belief that in fact, that the information was out there, and they should have known better. That in particular, there was this book written, no one would listen. Also, the SEC investigation said we screwed up, that the information was there, that everybody should have known this was the case. And if nothing else, there's just no way that you could have an investment that makes absolutely perfectly 11% return on investment every year with no variance. You surely should have known something was awry. So why was it? Well, there's a term that behavioral economists like to call, behavioral finance people in particular, called ostrich effects. And that is, there's a general tendency in life that we fail to seek out news that we suspect might be bad or have disappointing implications. Like, for example, what do people do in terms of looking at their retirement accounts during the Great Recession? How many people were there checking it every day to see how far down it had gone? So what was the general advice for how to deal with it? Don't look, It's only going to make you unhappy. Don't bother to look. Well, in some cases, that's okay? But in a lot of cases, if you generalize that can be pretty bad. Now, I want to say that, and this term will be important a little bit later, that ostrich effects have one big clear boundary, and that is we don't see them when the information that we're getting is very reliable, and it will allow us to with certainty to avoid bad outcomes. For example, reliable screening tests for preventable diseases. Likewise, studies that have been done of stockbrokers show that actually if they have a stock which is declining in value and so forth, actually the stockbrokers tend to attend more to what's going on with that stock rather than less. Where we do see these ostrich effects, however, is in three different domains. One of which is when the information itself is unreliable. Then in particular, one of the real problems with, for example, with mammography screening is that it's associated with a lot of false positives. And false positives are bad news because basically you get all worried about the outcome and then only to be told later, oh, don't worry. Well, there's a real psychic cost that's associated with that, and it's associated with people not wanting to take the test again. Another one is cases where it points to unpleasant remedies. For example, if there's a particular disease, it'd say, well, you're going to have to stop consuming your favorite foods. Well, I'm not going to want to take that test because I don't want to find out I don't want to consume my favorite foods. Or alternatively, I think what probably was going on a lot in the Madoff cases is here's where people were used to getting, they thought, reliable 11% returns. And for someone to say, hey, this is probably something shaky here. Why don't you get out and join the rest of the normal world where you're going to get 2 to 3% returns or highly volatile returns? Well, I don't want to do that. I'd rather keep the 11%, even though it's the case that it may not be real. And then finally, in cases where we have bad outcomes that are fundamentally untreatable. If you want a sure way to lose money, open up a company whose what it's doing is it sells early warning tests for late onset Alzheimer's. Okay, basically, it's very, very difficult to convince people to take that test. Okay, why is it? Well, there's nothing really you can do about it other than to get you worrying a whole lot earlier, and so on and so on. So in many respects, this turns out, in particular, the last two, turn out to be one of the big reasons why people that are involved in talking about climate change have a real difficult time convincing people or getting them to even listen to the message. Like, for example, do not look at this, okay? What this is a picture of recent sea level rise. This is from the 1880s to 2000s. This is taken in mid-latitude coastal parts of US and Europe. And if you see, it's going up, okay? And it's probably going to continue to go up. So when you look at this and you say, why do I want to look at this? Okay, what is it that I'm going to do about this? Okay, is there anything I can do to prevent it? Well, what I could do is I could not buy that great shore house that I was looking forward to buying. I was really looking for, I could not do this, I could not do that. And none of these are really particularly attractive remedies. And it's also a feeling that it's not us that we as individuals necessarily can do to prevent this thing from happening. So therefore, it's a type of message that we basically just want to block ourselves out to. And that's why this is a particularly difficult message to get out to people. So finally, the kind of the last of these three biases I'd like to talk a little bit about is maybe the most acute, and that is the tendency for history to repeat itself in disasters. Almost a lot of the research that I've done is in this particular domain, and one of the things that tends to happen in learning in general is we learn from getting positive reinforcement from things. So therefore, how do we learn to play tennis? Well, we know that we get positively rewarded when we do a certain action and it gets a point, and we basically learn not to repeat an action that has a disappointing outcome. One of the real difficulties with preparing against hazards and doing long-term investments, for example, buying flood insurance, is these are decisions which are rarely, if ever, positively reinforced. Most of the time when you renew that flood insurance policy, it's money down the drain, okay, because in fact you're not going to get a particular flood. And there's lots of examples of this. This is an extreme one. This is Miyako, Japan, and it's a city on about 50,000 that's in the northeast coast. This is a city which made the news in 2011 for a very, very unfortunate reason, and that is it was the site of the largest single tsunami height in the Great Earthquake and Tsunami. It was 30 meters high, which was the second highest tsunami ever recorded ever. And needless to say, the entire town was destroyed, and it was really it was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. And one of the things that's associated with this is, of course, media were drawn to the scene and looking over the scene of the tragedy, and they found out that actually Miyako was actually located in a bowl, and surrounding Miyako is a parkland that's with a bunch of trails that allow you to get kind of views looking down on the city. So news reporters were going around and trying to take pictures, and they noticed that there were these stone obelisks that were located in the hills above there that were built like in the 1600s, and there was a bunch of writing on them, and people were asking, well, what does that say? What's the writing mean? And it turns out the translation was this: high dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunami. Do not build any homes below this point. And so you can look at that and say, well, that was so many hundreds of years ago. People can't possibly certainly be forgiven for that. But in other cases, it's less easy to imagine how you could forgive people. A place that's kind of interesting is Pass Christian, Mississippi. And it's a small town on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and one thing that's sort of interesting about it is it started in active development in the 1950s, and there was one particular place there that sort of became somewhat historic. And in 1959, they built an apartment complex called Rashly Apartments, and it was a pretty formidable structure. It was all cement block construction, and it was right there on the water, and they had a pool in the middle, and when you could lounge out by the pool and look at the Gulf of Mexico and so forth. And in fact, the structure was considered so strong that it was the local civil defense center. Anyway, in 1969, Hurricane Camille was basically making a beeline for Pass Christian. Everybody was told to evacuate. And this was an extreme event. It was a Category 5 hurricane. Winds were like approaching 200 miles an hour. But yet people in the Rashly Apartments, not everybody left. There was about 27 people who decided they were going to ride it out. So at that time, everybody else left, and they said, well, good luck, enjoy it, because they knew they were an incredibly safe location. Well, this is what it looked like the morning after Hurricane Camille. It was completely leveled, and everybody that was in the apartment complex died. The actual number that was lost is a bit open to people don't really know, because we don't know how many people might have been visitors and so forth. But basically, people looked at this and said, this is sort of an example of, if there ever was one, of why you ought to evacuate in front of storm surges. So for a number of years, this particular lot in Pass Christian was left undeveloped. But then all of a sudden, in 1995, developer came along and said, and actually the early 90s, found this great plot of land and said, well, you got to build on land. And so they put up, they said, well, what we don't want to do is build an apartment complex, right? Because that will just remind people of the Camille hurricane. So they built a shopping center. And it had a Winn-Dixie and so forth. Well, anyway, this is that same location after Hurricane Katrina came through. Well, basically, it just wiped the lot clean once again. So I was curious as to, well, what do you do now with that particular plot of land? So actually, I called up the people who own the land, the management company, and I asked them, what do you plan to do with it? And so they said, well, we can't rebuild the shopping center because the new laws are going to require us to elevate things, and you can't have a shopping center which is elevated. So what we're going to do is we're hoping to use it to basically build condominiums back again. So this is a type of cycle which tends to go on and on. One final ouch plus one I'd like to talk about is sort of the other thing is the final source of error is that when we're unsure to do, we seek safety in herds. And this is a thing which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, but that the idea is that this is an unfortunate thing because it tends to be the people we tend to follow are no better informed than we are and often are subject to very, very much the same biases. Okay, so what can we do about all this? Okay, first of all, just a couple words on why I think we need to do something about this, certainly in the area of hurricanes. For example, this is the decadal distribution of the 32 costliest U.S. hurricanes from 1840 to 2011 in constant 2010 dollars. And you see, basically, all of a sudden in recent years, the losses from hurricanes have just basically gotten completely out of control. Of the 10 biggest hurricane losses ever, 8 of them have occurred since 2010. Why is that? Well, it's not due to global warming making hurricanes more common. In fact, actually, they're a little bit less common than they used to be. This is actually a timeline from 1900 of the relative frequency of U.S. landfalls. And it's kind of hard to see here, but basically you might notice that if you compare the number of landfalls since the 70s compared to the 40s and 50s, it's actually, we're in a relatively quiet period right now. So to me, this is pretty scary. Okay, because it basically says that the thing that you talked that would happen with Sandy, you don't have to believe in global warming, forget about sea level rise. All what we're talking about is a return to historical normalcy, and these events are going to become quite a bit more severe. Okay, so some principles about how do we fix any of this. Well, first of all, it's the idea that ouch biases are always going to be there. Trying to convince people to try to undo them and try to yell at people louder, remember, or prepare, is not going to work. A great example is in advance of Hurricane Ike, the National Hurricane Center warned people that if you were in certain areas, you will die with certainty. Okay? And it turns out that how many people of the people who faced certain death left? Well, most people did, but actually only 30% stayed behind and faced certain death. Okay, why is it? Well, it turns out that in Texas, stuff that comes from the government is not considered something you really ought to attend to. Okay, some other one is, so the best current thinking is what we call decision architecture. That is, create policies, economic incentives, and choice environments that presume the existence of these biases rather than try to reverse or override them. Like, for example, maybe the most common is this notion of defaults. that a common heuristic is if we're unsure what to do, just go ahead and choose the default box or whatever the click the accept button on when you're on terms and conditions and so forth. And so there's a lot of examples where this tends to come up. This is probably the most famous worldwide example of the power of defaults. This is actually a friend of mine who's up at Columbia, Eric Johnson, was involved in doing this. And what this is, it's a little bit fuzzy. I kind of cut and pasted off the internet. What it is, it's a graph that shows organ donation rates as that's associated with driver's licenses in different European countries. And as you notice, there's real extreme differences. The one that may be the most noticeable are these two bars right here, this little one right here, which is 12% in Germany and basically almost 100% in Austria. Okay, these are two countries that are right next to each other, speak the same language and so forth. Why is there such a big difference? Well, in one case, in Austria, it's the case that the default is, yes, you donate your organs and you can opt out. In Germany, it's the default is you don't have to, but you can opt in. And this turns out to be an extremely powerful device. So some of the things that we're doing currently at the Risk Center is exploring mechanisms by which we can make safety the default action. Most of the time, it's the case that why we don't prepare enough is we're uncertain and we don't know, well, what's normal safety, okay? So things like, for example, how do we overcome the problem of people not having flood insurance? Well, one possibility, for example, and these are sort of in orders of decreasing attractiveness to civil libertarians, is first of all, is make flood insurance opt out rather than opt in high-risk areas. So you can imagine as part of your normal taxes, automatically, given there's not a market for it, it's one price for it, that basically automatically you get flood insurance. But on the other hand, if you want to opt out and want to get a refund, you're more than welcome to do it. Another one, which my colleague Howard Conrather is spending a lot of time trying to develop, is this idea of sort of the health club model, or design long-term insurance policies where renewal each year is automatic, and you commit to it ex ante. When you buy your house, you're going to commit to having flood insurance for the next 20 years, and each year it's automatically renewed. And then finally, in some cases, it may be the case, like building codes, where you just have to legally require it, that there's nothing you can do. In other areas, it's sort of a harder nut to crack, is sort of the long tail problem. And there's going to be a lot of situations where, particularly when hazards are imminent, where you can't have a logical default, and you really have to rely on people to imagine that that what this extreme event is going to be. And this is a famous picture of someone emerging from the rubble after Hurricane Andrew in South Florida in 1992. And as I mentioned earlier, people who suffer extreme events and really know what they're like, they don't have a problem. So some of the things that we're playing around with right now is at the Risk Center, we're in the process of developing sort of virtual simulations to allow people to experience extreme events without ever actually having to go through them. It turns out, though, that vicariously experiencing something is not quite the same as suffering a personal loss, but we're sort of trying to move in that direction. Another one is developing norms of safety. How is it that you get, another default would be to have a social norm, that you just look what everybody else is doing. Well, this turns out to be also problematic because you need to get people commonly to all of a sudden collectively want to do it. So one of the problems, for example, in getting messages out is that people only listen to their friends and so forth. So for example, this was a study that was done in looking at asking people, how much of these different people do you trust to tell you about global warming? The people that we're caring about are the red line, or the people who are inclined not to want to listen. And so it turns out that for people who are disinclined, there's three people they want to hear from. Okay, they'll listen to their church, they'll listen to their friends, and they'll listen to their doctor. Okay? So basically, somehow or another, if you want to get people to invest more in protection, you got to get the doctor to talk about it, you get their the pastor or the rabbi to talk about it, or you got to get their friends to talk about it. And this is a very, very difficult thing to get going. Some of the things we've been working with other groups to try to get started, for example, the Institute for Home Building and Safety is trying to do this idea of branding safety. The idea is that if we see someone else has a really Category 5 home, well, I want a Category 5 home. Or the other one is this idea of getting it started with kids. That once you're beyond the age of 20, it's too late. But if you can get kids that are 6 or 7, basically within day-to-day basis reminded of this safety norm, then in fact it's worthwhile. It's something that can be developed. Let me just kind of wrap up with a couple of conclusions, and I'm going to get like your reactions to some of this stuff. All signs suggest that we're kind of we have some rough sledding ahead. And I don't care whether you're talking about natural disasters or man-made disasters, we have very, very high levels of vulnerability. This whole topic of risk management, which used to be in many firms sort of a backdoor item, is now very much front burner. Operational risk officers are sort of increasingly common in a lot of organizations that you didn't seem to need them before. And what is it going to take to solve them? Well, I think the solutions are going to be hard because in many cases we're fighting an uphill battle against an intuitive psychology which is not necessarily to make these investments. And it's going to require a lot of joint work from people who have a lot of different perspectives. And I'd like to end kind of on one final plug, and that's for our Wharton Risk Center. The Wharton Risk Center is probably the world's leading institution right now that's trying to achieve a lot of that fusing. And the stuff that I've talked about tonight is just sort of a little bit snippet, a little bit of an ad of some of the stuff that we're involved in. And I really encourage everyone to, as much as you have an interest in this area, to look us up on the web. We have a lot of information that we're providing in terms of the work that we're doing in this area. And ideally, become more personally involved through sponsorship or just communicating with us. So thank you very much.